This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And today's episode is on one of my all-time favorite findings in psychology or human sciences more generally. And the finding is this: giving away, being generous, being nice, it feels good. Now, I think we can all remember times when we've experienced this, but it's very easy to read this off as an individual instance, something about us being very nice or the rewards we got, whether smiles or hugs or praise from it. But it turns out, after years of very, very serious studies on this topic, it really looks like giving just feels good. And I have just loved this finding because I'm a bit of an optimist. I did my master's thesis on Mencius Mengzi, a Chinese philosopher famous for him saying that human nature is good. And I'm not one of those people who think that humans never do bad things or that human evil is somehow a product of our rotten civilization. But what I do believe in is that there are some interesting inclinations, asymmetries in the human psyche, such that yes, we can be very nasty or we can be very nice. But the rewards, the internal feelings that the fruits that we reap from those actions are not identical. So why am I so confident about it? Well, mostly because of studies conducted by Lara Aknin and her colleagues. Lara is a professor at the University of British Columbia who is the only person I know alive. There might be others, but the only person I know of who has gotten her master's thesis published in Science magazine, which is just an unheard of feat. That was on some early studies she ran on the science of generosity, and she's kept doing that work ever since. And we are so much wiser thanks to her work. But I think that one of the reasons I also trust it is that it just resonates very strongly with my own experience. I've actually applied this to my life. I have literally used this as a mental health intervention to myself during a tough period when I wasn't doing so well. And I decided that for the next week, every day, I will find some trivially small, generous act to do. And I have to say that I kind of knew it's going to work, but I was still struck of how well it did. And so listening to this show is hopefully not just out of academic interest, but hopefully this can also be something that we can all apply to our own lives. So anyway, it was really an honor to have her on the show. We talk about the research showing that while humans are not always generous, there is a benefit to being so. We talk about whether this is just something that happens in Western rich environments. We talk about her studies around the world and her work with very young children. And of course, we touch upon the really important point, which is that giving doesn't always feel good as such. I mean, we all know about care fatigue, especially in context of, for example, caring about someone with dementia, the example that we discuss here. Not always a source of joy, even if very meaningful in other ways. So why is that? How does that relate to the long conversation we have about yay, let's give. We talk about the relationship between giving and altruism or selfishness. And as always, we finish with my guests' reflections on humanity. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I'm also pretty convinced that I've never had such a natural segue into what I'm going to say next, which is that if you do like this, do show some generosity. It can be as simple as taking a couple of seconds to click that subscribe button or those 5 stars if you think that I deserve it. And also, if you want to, head to onhumans.substack.com to order the On Humans newsletter. And finally, I do want to thank the very, very generous people who have, for whatever reason, decided to contribute monthly to making my work more sustainable. Thank you so much. And if you feel generous today and you want to join the group, that's patreon.com/onhumans. And just to motivate you a little bit further on that path, today happens to be the 2nd anniversary of the show. It was October 1st, 2022 that I published the first episode. That was with Patricia Churchland. A wonderful one. I think that's still one of my favorite episodes. I highly recommend that. Anyway, let's get the show started. If there are any names that we mention or any articles you want to check out, there's a lot of useful resources in the show notes. Head there. You'll also find my email there. You can get in touch with me if you want to chat about the show or if you want to support the show, but patreon.com is not for you. But anyway, without further ado, I bring to you Lara Aknin. Professor Lara Aknin, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you for having me.
I'm pretty confident that I have never referenced anyone's master's thesis work as much as yours. So why don't we start there? How did you end up there? What did you do? What did you find?
My master's thesis work was a lot of fun and published back in 2008. And so that was when I was just starting graduate school with Elizabeth Dunn at the University of British Columbia. And so Liz was a new faculty member at UBC, and I think for the first time had some extra funds in her bank account and was trying to think about how she could spend that money in service of her happiness. And I had a particular affinity or interest in prosociality, doing kind things. And so we kind of put our two interests together and started questioning whether people could spend their money on others, and whether that might bring people some happiness. And so from there, we conducted a series of studies that was published back in 2008, kind of which very straightforwardly in the title argued that spending money on others can promote happiness.
Can you give an idea of the kind of original experiment?
Sure. Yeah. So the paper involved four studies. The first one was just a correlational data set, in which we asked a large sample of Americans to tell us how much money they spend on others in a typical month. And by that, I mean on gifts for others or donations to charity. So that was what we kind of lumped together as our form of what we called pro-social spending. So how much money people spend on others in a typical month. And we also created an index of what we called personal spending, or how much money people spent on themselves in a typical month. And simply put, we found that the more money people spend on others, the happier they reported feeling, while how much they spent on themselves did not predict their well being. And importantly, this held even when we controlled for income, suggesting that it's not just how much money people have, but how they choose to spend it that might influence their happiness.
So this is the moment where if I would have a psychology tutorial, I would show my students, okay, look, we have this correlation.
Exactly.
They ruled out the possibility that it's just, if you're richer, you both spend more money on yourself and on others or whatnot. However, it's a correlation. So we don't know if it's
Exactly.
generosity making you happy or being happy that makes you generous.
Right. Or some other third variable, right? It could be that spending money on other people leads to stronger friendships, which is truly what is driving this happiness, right?
And so as I would tell any of the students, I would say, and therefore we need an experiment.
That's right.
I think this is so important, and perhaps for some listeners, I mean, enlightening in the sense that anyone training in psychology will, terms like experiment is like the water where we swim in. But I think outside of, it's very easy for people to use the word experiment and study interchangeably. But yeah, experiment,
Yes.
very, very importantly different than just another study, and that you are the one who decides who's going to do what. You decide that some of these people are going to be generous.
That's right. And so that study in particular must have been, I think it was one of the highlights of my graduate school career, because I got to go out in the morning hours on campus. I recruited students one at a time and invited them to take part in this study on everyday spending choices. And if they agreed, I stuck my hand into a bag and pulled out an envelope, to randomly assign people to one of four conditions in our experiment. And so critically in our study, we had kind of two main things that we manipulated. The first was how much money we gave people to spend that day. It was either a $5 windfall or a $20 windfall. But critically, we also randomly assigned people to spend the money in one of two fashions, either on themselves in the form of this personal spending, so on a bill, expense, or gift for themselves, or on a form of pro-social spending, where we asked people to buy a gift for someone else or make a charitable donation. And we recruited everyone in the morning hours so that they had a number of hours to go about their day and kind of make their spending choice, their decision. And then someone from our research team called them in the evening at the end of the day to hear how their day went and how they were feeling. And importantly, the people making the phone call were unaware of how much money this person had received and what they had been asked to do, so that they didn't bias the questions in any way. And simply put, what we found at the end of the day was people who were randomly assigned to spend money on others reported significantly higher levels of happiness than people who were randomly assigned to spend on themselves. It didn't matter whether it was $5 or $20, it was really about who they spent the money on, that led to these differences in happiness. I mean, looking back now, the standards of sample size in psychology have changed quite drastically since we ran this study back in 2008. So the sample was quite small by today's standards. So our final sample size was close to 50. I'm happy to speak about how we've run larger studies since, though, by the way.
Yeah,
And
we
if
should
that's
definitely do that. And like I said, I mean, I keep talking about this. It kind of keeps coming up in my life again and again. I kind of remind myself of this fact that, yeah, it's quite interesting that actually, I recently just kind of got this random windfall of 70 euros, and I was like, what am I going to do with this? And it was one of those moments. I haven't spent it yet, but I made a decision, made a conscious decision, perhaps primed by preparing for this, that I'm going to spend this on some fun pro-social ways.
That's wonderful. Have you pinned down the specifics?
So I haven't noticed. I've been kind of keeping my eye open. I went to buy coffee the other day, and I thought that if there is someone behind me on the line, I'm going to buy them coffee. But then there wasn't anyone. So far, I still have it 70 euros in my pocket. Anyway, the point is that I keep coming back to this, and what I think is so wonderful is I think Bertrand Russell, the philosopher Bertrand Russell, once said something about how a great work is often one which has a very, very simple idea that you can say in, like, a couple of sentences. And then the rest of the work is just exploring all the kind of possible counter arguments, explaining why it actually holds. And I think that a lot of what I see when I look at like your list of publications seems that this is just taking this really simple idea, which is that for whatever mysterious reason, generosity seems to lead into better mood, into more happiness, and seeing, well, does this really hold? Because there's so many obvious questions there. This is a small sample size. This is what Canadian undergrads. Whatever. There's so many kind of possible ways, and you do address those in so many different ways. And I think maybe a nice way to start looking at what that has looked like would be to go to Vanuatu.
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the key questions that has motivated a lot of my research is whether this original finding that we documented in North America might hold in other places and cultures and lived experiences. And I think that's a very reasonable question to ask because, when you start with what many might consider a convenient sample, undergraduate students at a North American college, you might question whether they live some form of extraordinary lives by a global standard. And so that's really motivated me to really push the boundaries and see how far or how common this finding might be when we try to understand humans more broadly.
That's what we're trying to do on this show. So that's wonderful.
Perfect. Perfect. So one of the ways in which I tried to address this question was to look at some global data, and then to go to places where, the human experience will look very different than that of an undergraduate student at a North American college campus. And so for that, I partnered with a new colleague and friend of mine, Tanya Brush, and I traveled to Vanuatu, where she has a field site set up. In fact, she was just establishing this field site shortly after we were both hired as assistant professors. And the goal there was to really try to see whether the emotional rewards of giving might also be detectable amongst a small scale rural village where people live lives that are much more similar to our human ancestors.
Well, like, by the way, they're not hunter gatherers?
Some of them are. I mean,
Some of them are.
so they're not necessarily. There are nearby villages that are hunter gatherers, and in this community in particular, it was more farming based. Many of them lived off the land. I mean, there was no running water, there was no electricity, there was very little formal education. There was a kindergarten classroom, but very little education, scaffolded education beyond that. In fact, some of the neighboring villages, which were quite closely connected through marriage, there was an active rejection of Western education policies or practices. And so it was a very different cultural context to be able to test this question.
I'm happy you said that, because hearing a distant place can evoke feelings of difference. But like, I've lived in New Zealand. It's very far away. It's not very different.
Yes.
So, even the Maori villages in New Zealand wouldn't be like, in the same way, drastically different.
Right.
But so in here, apparently, yes, this is a very different context. So what was it like for you?
Well, it was one of the most challenging and also one of the most rewarding personal research experiences I've ever had. My friend Tanya, who had this connection, she brought me to Vanuatu. She helped me in the main city do the translations and back translations so that everything could go according to plan. I had never done anything of this scope of cross-cultural research before. And then she delivered me to the village and introduced me to the chief and to the one or two women who spoke English. But she was pregnant and couldn't take malaria medication at the time. And so she kind of had to leave me and go back to Vancouver. And so it was me and a student trying to run these studies. And it was a wonderful experience. And the short story, and I can dig into the details if you like, is that we ran kind of a parallel version of the experiment we had run before, a version of what we call the goodie bag paradigm, where we invite people normally through a paper and pencil task to learn that they have earned an additional sum that they can use to purchase something for themselves or for someone else. After and to make it clear that there's no joke, there's no trick to the whole thing. People actually get to see the materials in front of them. They pick what it is they want or what it is they want to give away,
So is it
depending on.
like candies or?
Yes, normally these are edible treats. These were treats that people living in a village, many of them who had never left the village, had never seen before. So these were pretty novel, exciting, treats to be able to select from. So people in the pro-social condition were choosing some treats that they could give away to a fellow villager, and people in the personal condition saw the same array of treats, but they were deciding what it is they would like to pick for themselves. Moments later, we asked participants to report how happy they were feeling on an alternative scale. And then later, when data collection was done, we ran analyses to see who reported higher levels of happiness. Those who were in the pro social condition who purchased treats for a fellow villager versus those who were in the personal condition and bought the treats for themselves.
How did you measure, by the way, how do you measure happiness in that context?
So, in most of our experiments conducted in North America, we asked people to self report their happiness on these validated happiness scales. But in Vanuatu, we had to make some accommodations because, first and foremost, many of our participants did not read and write. And so we couldn't just hand them a paper and pencil questionnaire and ask them to have at it. We instead needed to make some adjustments. And so we had one local researcher who was orally posing these questions and then transcribing people's responses. And instead of using long winded scales, what instead we did was we asked about a couple's very specific positive emotions, like people's happiness and so on. And instead of just giving a numerical scale that might be a vague concept to someone who doesn't think about numerical scales on a regular basis, we presented an image of a 10 or 11 rung ladder and we told people that the top represents the most of this happiness, the bottom represents the absence or very little of it. Show us where you feel on this.
I mean, this is very similar, right, than the kind of master question in the World Happiness Report.
Similar in concept, yes, to the Cantrell ladder, except the Cantrell ladder asked people about their life satisfaction as a whole, taking everything considered relative to what they imagine is the best possible life, worst possible life. This was about a specific emotion right now.
Yeah. As a Finn, and I'm actually right now recording from Finland. I'm of course very interested whenever I hear that one more time. We are the world's happiest nation, and at least I think we can put a little plug here, noticing well, happiest, perhaps in some definition, at least seems to be the most satisfied with our lives on on looking at a ladder and imagining where we are. If we would ask who experiences the most positive emotions, we would get very different countries in the number one. I've heard that it would be a Latin American country.
Yes, I was gonna say, I don't know the specifics, but I'm quite sure it would be a Latin American country, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard like some years it's Paraguay, sometimes Mexico, Costa Rica. But staying in Vanuatu, you mentioned that the paradigm had changed a little bit from in Canada in the original thing. You just give money and you say spend this on someone else, and now you have this more regimented goodie bag paradigm. Who you give this candy now to someone who? Um, what are the counter arguments here? The possible alternative explanations that you wanted to rule out? I think that could actually be quite a helpful um, moment in the weeds if we go there for like a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so the goodie bag paradigm was first, we introduced that before Vanuatu and with a more rigorous set of rules to address a number of alternative explanations for why giving might feel good. So, one of the reasons that giving might feel good is that you expect a form of reciprocity in return. So, if I take you for coffee today and I feel good about it afterward, one reason is that I'm happy to see you feel good. But another explanation is I'm imagining you are going to take me for coffee next Tuesday. And so, one of the ways we designed this goodie bag paradigm to address that concern was that in the original instantiation of it, people were giving to someone who they would never meet and who didn't know that they had given. And so, if it was to address this alternative explanation that you only feel good about giving because you expect some form of reciprocity in return.
Okay. So giving candies or whatnot to someone does feel good even when they don't know that it was you who gave.
Yes.
Okay.
So, in the original form of this paradigm, people were buying treats for either themselves, like cans of soda or chocolate bars for themselves, or they were packaging a goodie bag of these treats to give to a sick child at a local children's hospital. And importantly, we told them that, we're going to make this donation. In fact, I have a picture of us dropping off hundreds and hundreds of goodie bags at our local children's hospital. But it's not like the giver's name was attached to this gift. The recipients received a gift, but they had no idea who it came from. And so there was no possibility the child at the local children's hospital was ever going to return the favor. The other alternative explanation the original goodie bag paradigm was designed to address was that giving might feel good because you get reputational benefits. So if I take you for coffee, or I take even my niece or nephew who is, 3 years old, if I take him for coffee, it's not like I'm not expecting him to take me for coffee next week, but everybody around me is seeing me do a nice deed. And so I might feel good because now have this elevated stature or position in other people's eyes. And the original of the goodie bag was also designed to address that concern because through some intricate paperwork and a lot of planning, what we had our participants do was to make a pro social or a personal purchase, but nobody else knew what they were doing. And so it's not like anybody could give them a wink or a pat on the back. They knew that nobody else was aware of their kind or personal purchase. And so it was really, we were trying to remove these alternative explanations.
Yeah, and a third one that comes to my mind could be that, it's just a lot of, if I buy a coffee for myself, I'm alone. If I buy a coffee for a friend, it increases social connection, which is great. And there's not a reason not to do it, by the way. But it could be that, yeah, it makes us feel good, but it makes us feel good because it increases social connection. And am I right that in a way the goodie bag paradigm helps you also avoid that in a
Yeah.
sense?
So the
Yeah.
original version of the goodie bag paradigm was basically people completing a questionnaire packet by themselves. They had, maybe about 1 minute of exposure to another person where they actually got to see the items laid out on a table and they made a selection. The other person packaged up their selection, but they had no idea whether the selection was for them or for charity. And the amount of social contact, if you will, was consistent across conditions. And so it's not like people who were doing generous things had more face time with another person.
And it's funny because I mean it wouldn't be an it would if your original result that getting $5 or $20 on a Canadian campus and deciding because the experimental told you to spend it on others makes you happy. And the reason it makes you happy is because it increases social connection. I mean, that wouldn't be a bad finding. That would still be a cool finding.
Yes. Well, for what it's worth, so subsequent studies that are folks in my lab and Liz's lab and other people have conducted have shown that we do experience more emotional rewards from generous actions when generous actions are social. That being said, I think what the goodie bag paradigm teaches us is that even when we strip away that social contact, we can still see these emotional rewards of giving, even when people are by themselves.
And then, of course, the question is, well, where on earth does this come from? And one theory would be that it's an internalized, we've been told that sharing is good, and therefore it's our internal, I don't know, yeah, internalized father figure clapping at us or whatnot.
Yeah, we've indoctrinated kids.
Yes, and so in Vanuatu, I mean, and in many other places, but you've also done these studies on very young children.
Yes, yeah. So in Vancouver, what we did was we first recruited a sample of toddlers who were just under the age of 2. They were 22 months. There were about 20 of them. They came into the lab one at a time with a parent or guardian, and we basically ran a puppet show or like a small little demonstration in front of them that took about 3 to 5 minutes for each of them to watch and participate in. And so um, what we did was we asked the child to sit on the caregiver's lap. They were introduced to a puppet named Monkey, who was a monkey stuffed animal, and they were told that Monkey liked eating treats just like them. And then they were allowed to meet the puppet, to interact with the puppet, and then each child was given a bowl with 8 edible treats, and these were treats that kids like. And so the experimenter gave 8 of those to the child. Then, over the next few minutes, the child was asked to watch or participate in 3 key actions. The first action, what we just called observing a prosocial act, was the child was asked to watch as the experimenter gave one treat to the monkey puppet. We also had another phase where the child was asked to give one of their own treats to the puppet. And the final one, although these came in random order, was the child was asked to give one of the experimenter's treats to the puppet. Now, every time the monkey puppet got a treat, they ate it in a very loud and excitable fashion.
And so wait, but those are all pro-social conditions. Or was there an equivalent where the monkey doesn't get anything, but the kids get themselves?
Well, that was what we considered the phase of the experiment where the child received 8 treats themselves.
I see, I see. Yeah, so basically, yeah, first they get something themselves, and then then there is a pro-social. Okay, and that can take three forms.
Yep. So they either watch the experimenter give a treat, so they get to see monkey enjoy the treat that's not from them. They get to be involved in the act of giving that from the researchers pool. So we call that the non-costly form of giving because the child gets to give, but at no personal cost. And then the other form was to give with personal sacrifice, if you will.
Yeah, okay, I know we're following. So now the question is, when are the kids smiling the most? Is it when they get candies? Is it when they see a happy monkey eating someone else's candies? Is it when they get to make that be the case? So it's still someone else's candies, but they are involved. Or is it when they do a costly candy sacrifice?
Exactly. And so exactly, you laid that out. And I should say that when we started testing this question, we naively thought we could just ask 2-year-olds to tell us how happy they are by having them point at a smiley face, but that did not work out according to plan. All little kids were just pointing at random at almost at all the happy faces. And so we had to come up with another plan, which was to put a video camera behind the experimenter looking at the child so we could see how much or to what degree the child smiled during each of these key phases. And what we found was that children smiled significantly more when they were giving away a treat to monkey than when they were receiving the 8 treats themselves. So, regardless of what form of giving we're talking about, whether it's costly or non-costly, both of those led to greater smile expressions than when children were receiving 8 treats themselves.
So again, the same pattern than in the Canadian campus. Yeah.
Exactly. And what we also saw in those data were that children smiled significantly more when they gave away their own treats than when they gave away an identical treat that did not belong to them, such that costly giving might be more emotionally rewarding than non costly giving
And at a very young age.
at a very young age. So our goal was to go as young as we possibly could to try to address this concern about whether we're indoctrinating or socializing young children to feel good about giving.
Which again wouldn't be like it wouldn't take away the
No.
importance, but yeah, it's perhaps the more cynically inclined way of
Mhm.
approaching
Yes.
anything nice about human emotions.
And I think, and so children did, they showed a bit more positive emotion when they were watching the monkey receive treats, even in comparison to when they receive the treats. Like, I think children do feel good when they see someone else enjoy a positive experience. But the question we were focused on was whether giving led to greater emotional rewards than receiving, like you pointed out with this parallel with adults. Fast forward a few years, I tested this question also in Vanuatu with kids, the village, and we found very similar patterns, almost identical.
I really love this because I was studying psychology during, I think, pretty much during the time that the weird acronym started being a thing. Weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. The idea that most of the people psychology study are weird, and I was always like, yeah, this is like a super relevant point. But I also had a part of me who was like, yeah, but I don't know how many of these things would be dramatically different when you take them somewhere. Some things are, but my feeling was always like, let's just do the study somewhere else, and often we're gonna find some reasonably similar results, and this is such a nice example of that. Um, and actually, I think that when you read through the kind of original weird criticisms, a lot of them are like some effect is less strong, less pronounced in another context. There are examples where it completely flips around. Maybe we can spend like a couple of minutes on this. How much have we, when we started doing this thing that you've done, for example, going to very remote places, how many things have we find where it's not that the effect is a little bit less strong or it's stronger or something, but it's completely like turned things upside down?
Well, I mean, I can't speak to every dimension of human behavior under the sun. What I know best is this area of prosociality, and I think by and large, what we found is for the most part, we tend to see variation in size, such that, in most places around the world, giving seems to feel good. The question is just to how strongly does this predict well-being. That being to your point, I think that speaks to, more generalizability, more similarity than difference. Where I have seen some really fascinating differences, though, is in how people help others, right? In some of our cross-cultural work, we've become quite strikingly aware of how help can vary across time and place. So for instance, when we were in our early days, we were studying how people, we would ask people at the end of the day when we gave them the $5 or $20, we asked them to spend on themselves or others. Part of our follow up phone call was, so tell me about how you spent your money. And some people reported, taking friends for a lot of it had to do with food. So I took a friend for coffee, or I brought home a pizza for the family, whatever it might be. But people also would buy their parents, meanwhile, when we went to Uganda and to India and to other places and we were studying pro social spending, people were buying medication for people that they cared about. They were addressing some very basic needs, oftentimes, which I didn't know was such a key concern and key thing or valuable resource, but people were buying airtime, basically cell phone time to be able to connect with loved ones.
Would that be Uganda especially?
Yes, particularly in Uganda.
Yeah, my impression of sub-Saharan Africa is it's really interesting. I mean, I'm sure that there are big differences, but I remember, for example, when I was in Zambia and Malawi, the amount of presence that airtime as a word has, just like
Mhm.
that was like one of the most important commodities, and I was like, I guess that makes sense.
Yes, it
Like,
was a
why not?
very salient, frequently mentioned feature. And so, originally I wouldn't have nominated that as something as a way in which people
Yes,
help others and what it might
yes,
look like. But stepping back, I mean, I guess what that led me to think about is, at some level of analysis, there's a lot of difference. But I think in some time, at least in the realm of prosociality, if you zoom up a level and start to think about like beyond the idiosyncrasies of what people in these different cultures, how they might show affection and care and concern for another people. If we zoom up, we start to see that pretty consistently as a human experience, people feel good when they're showing that care for other people.
so why?
Why is that? I think it's because we as humans have evolved to be these very social creatures. We survive it best in the presence of other people. I think um, we can't really survive alone. I think that's why loneliness is so painful.
And so deadly.
Yes. And I think that's one of the reasons why prosociality is so important for our well-being is that or a predictor of well-being is that it provides an opportunity to build connections with other people and strengthen connections with other people. It's one clear way of showing care and concern for other people. Now, it doesn't always need to take a physical form, but I think prosociality kind of is an investment in our relationships, is an investment in other people. And so I think these opportunities to connect and show our affection for other people are pretty consistently associated with well-being.
Yeah, so in a way, would you say then that it's not that when we do a pro-social act, it needs to be via connecting with others that we get the happiness, but the reason that our brains are thus designed that was that throughout natural history, throughout the human journey, it has been a way of strengthening connections, and that's the kind of evolutionary mechanism by which we inherited this brain that just benefits directly.
Yeah, and I mean, to be clear, I don't think every singular instance of pro-social spending or pro-sociality is always guaranteed to bring positive mood, right? There are times in which we give and it can really backfire. But I think by and large, when we give, we tend to show our care and affection for others. It tends to have a positive impact on the recipient. And so I think we have way more hits than misses. And so even though not every time needs to be social, not every time needs to be a perfect, beautiful, meaningful exchange. I think over time, we've had way more positive experiences with giving as a species and as an individual that giving tends to make us feel good.
And what about then kind of giving fatigue or care? I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone that there is a limit, whether it's because of a job where you kind of have to keep giving attention or time or whatnot, overworked nurses, etc. there's a whole kind of sub literature on pathological altruism. I don't necessarily like the word pathological, but the idea that sometimes altruism can kind of go too far. My personal take on this is that, well, it is an important question, but for most people listening and wondering how they're going to spend the 70 euros that they've randomly got, that's not going to be the main worry. But when does it become a worry?
So I think you're right. I mean, most of the time, my colleagues and I have not been arguing that, we should stop paying our bills and spend all money on others. It's kind of been it's been a kind of counter argument to suggest that, instead of solely spending on ourselves, we can look to other opportunities to spend on others, and that will make us happy. But you're right. There certainly is a literature showing that, giving too much of ourselves, especially to a point where we can no longer care for ourselves and the people closest to us, like if you remortgage your house and give it all away, not only might you be in less of a secure position, but if you have dependents, so are they. That can be problematic. Um, so I think part of it is giving up to a certain point at which one can still be stable and have their basic needs met. The other feature that I think is important to consider in the literature is that in many of these instances where giving can kind of cross a tipping point and become problematic, or can be difficult and have start to have a negative impact on one's well-being instead of a positive consequence, is when people are giving and it's not having a positive impact. So for instance, imagine being a caregiver for someone you love who has Alzheimer's and dementia. Well, moments that might be a very deeply meaningful experience, because you're caring for a partner or a parent or a friend or someone that means the world to you. Your care is not going to cure this condition. You might be there to improve certain moments and be by their side, but it's not necessarily going to bring you joy and happiness in those moments. It might bring other meaningful things, don't get me wrong, but, I think part of it is that when people can keep giving and giving and they're not necessarily going to change the course of the outcome, that can be, that can be a difficult point where, we're not gonna be necessarily tracking emotional rewards. There might be other outcomes that are very meaningful, but I don't think it's gonna be producing joy.
That makes perfect sense because I haven't run this experiment, but I don't think we even need to run the experiment. uh, Anyone who imagines one of those kids who gives the candy to the monkey, if the monkey would just be like crying, and no matter how many candies the kid gives to the monkey, at some point it's going to be frustrating, and it stops being rewarding. So, and I think it's a very big part of that experiment is the fact it's from the joy of the monkey that at least part of the feeling comes from, I guess, to the kids. And so the Alzheimer's would be a very kind of real life adult version of that, is that, you give, and it's not like suddenly you see this big happy face every time you try to do something you might be shouted at because your deed was misunderstood, or
Mhm.
forgotten the next moment. So that makes perfect sense.
Mhm. And indeed, some of our more recent work trying to understand when these emotional rewards of giving are most likely, kind of we've been skirting around it, but maybe it's helpful for me to lay out kind of these three key conditions we find are important. So the first is when giving is volitional. So when people choose to give, they feel a lot happier about their giving than when they are forced to give.
But even when they're forced, they can be happy, like your experiments prove.
Well, yes and no. So short answer might be yes, but I also think I didn't make this point clear when I was describing the goodie bag paradigm. But in the goodie bag paradigm, we randomly assigned people to the personal condition where they bought candy for themselves, or the pro-social condition where they bought candy for a sick child at a local children's hospital. But we also said, if you want, you can opt out and claim the cash for yourself. Now, we made it strategically very difficult. We told people that if you choose to opt out and keep the cash for yourself, you have to come in at 8 a.m. in 3 months from now to pick up the
Okay.
money. So
That's
everybody was
good.
like, I'm not
I
going to
understand.
bother doing that. But this illusion of choice was there.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah.
And so volition or choice is the first. The second one is the social aspect of giving. So the goodie bag paradigm, I think here does show that, we could almost all but remove social contact and still feel good about giving. But some of our other research shows that when you amp up the social connection, you amp up the emotional rewards.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and the third one is this perceived impact. So to the extent that which you understand that you're having a positive impact on others, the more likely you are to feel good about giving. Now that also seems completely obvious, but when you think about it, there are some charities that do a really good job of showing you how exactly your dollars are going to improve the lives of people
Mm,
who need it. And some charities they're a little bit more silent on it. Like I think, for instance, the Against Malaria Foundation does a beautiful job of telling you that for every $10, you're buying a bed net to stop the spread of
yeah.
malaria through Africa. Other charities say, you're going to help us protect this greenland, this marshland and whatever, but they don't tell you where exactly or how much land or
Yeah,
whatnot.
yeah.
The particulars are absent. And so to the
It does
extent
take some motivational effort for me to keep donating to some of the climate
Mhm.
charities that
Yeah.
I've been
And
supporting because it's like I see nothing, of course. It's just they
yeah.
go negotiate somewhere.
And that's a hard sell. I mean, all this to say that, to the extent that charities and individuals have an opportunity to recognize, to see the impact of their gift, the more likely they are or their help, the more likely they are to feel good. And that those emotional rewards are important because they further initiate or propel subsequent generosity. And so this all ties back to the point that we were making is that sometimes giving can become perhaps a net loss for well-being when people don't see the positive impact of their gift, right? So like you said, if you kept giving to a monkey that burst into tears every time, at some point you're going to say this isn't having a positive impact. In fact, it's having the opposite. So I'm going to stop, right? So not only are you're going to you might stop your action, you're also not going to feel good about it.
Why is it so difficult to stay generous? I mean, like I said, I keep coming back to these findings. I find them so inspirational. Um, then I would like to think of myself as a generous person. But then if I at the end of the day I look at the amount of money I give to charity, it's very small. There's always an explanation. I can explain to myself, yeah, I'm in a state of life where I'm donating my time to,
Mhm.
science communication. So,
Yeah.
and therefore I'm struggling to pay the bills. So it's not the time yet. And, of
Yeah.
course, but, I don't know if I'm nearly as generous as I could be. And, I remember recently, Chris Anderson, the entrepreneur behind TED Talks, he published the book, Infectious Generosity. I think it was the first book I got this year in 2024, and very inspirational. Similar things that we talk about, a little bit less of the science, but also some of the science. Your work was there. Um, Good stuff, very inspirational. And then it comes to the end, and he has this very reasonable suggestions of how much we should give, for example,
Mhm.
every year from our income or wealth. And then I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll think about that. I still haven't acted on it.
Mhm.
So why is it so difficult? Besides the obvious question that sometimes we are just don't have the money, but we always have something. Why is it so difficult?
Well, I think that's a big and complicated question that probably has multiple answers. I think one challenge or difficulty is that I think in a very academic sense, especially when people hear about this work, they're like, "Oh yeah, that resonates," right? Like I feel good when I give, but I think in everyday life, when push comes to shove, and people, come across a windfall for 70 euros or stick their hand in their winter coat that they haven't worn since last year and find a crumpled up bill,
Yeah.
their natural intuition is not to necessarily go out and spend money on others, or at least um, it might not always be the first thing that people think about when the opportunity crosses their mind. I think we ran some experiments actually coming full circle to where we began in the original science paper that was published from my master's thesis. We asked a large sample of people to consider the four conditions we had in our experiment: spending $5 on yourself, $5 on someone else, 20 on yourself, or 20 on someone else. And we said, what do you think will make you happiest? And overwhelmingly, people picked spending money on themselves. And
I
so,
see. So there is actually need for this information to be there.
yes,
It's not that people know and don't act. It is actually that we need to be reminded of this.
I don't think everybody's walking around thinking if I do a nice thing, I'm going to feel bad. But when push comes to shove and resources are limited, people make the choice in many occasions to spend on themselves. And I think what we can take these nudges, we can take this information, and hopefully start changing our behavior. I should say though that one beautiful way to interpret these data that I've just told you about, which is that most people don't recognize that giving is going to make them happier than spending on themselves, I think brings up a really interesting philosophical point, which is that most people are not walking around doing kind things or donating to charity because they want to feel good.
Yes.
They're doing it because they care about the outcome.
Yes.
They care about the person they're trying to help. They're not doing it through selfish motivations. And so I think that's kind of a beautiful flip side to this lack of insight.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a really interesting one. That also reminds me, I've heard you say somewhere about how um, people generally, of course, like seeing good things being done. Like someone gives candy to the monkey that you like as a kid. You're like, yeah, you great. But we're very, very sensitive to indications that people are doing it for selfish reasons. I think doing it for the feeling that I might actually benefit happiness wise from it, I think this might be actually a third category. Let's leave it aside. But first, thinking about there's obvious possibilities. One is, I really care about the situation. The other one is, oh, I'm going to look really good or I'm going to get a promotion if I just donate to my boss's charity, whatever. And I've heard you say that this is something that humans are surprisingly kind of sensitive to cues of selfish motivations behind pro-social acts. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So when you take this into the greater context of understanding human evolution and how we figure out who are our people, who are we safe with, who can we trust in this environment, when it comes to we talked about how one reason that prosociality might feel good is because it helps us kind of build and facilitate these connections with other people. And in a vacuum, that might lead people to give and give. Excuse me, that might lead people to give and give and give in a way that they could be exploited, right? So if we're constantly giving and we're constantly building these relationships and other people are not showing any form of reciprocity, we could easily be exploited in the world around us. And so I think the flip side of this emotional reward of giving is that we've not only have we evolved to feel good about helping others and engaging in pro-social acts, but we've also evolved to be very careful about who it is we give to, such that we don't give in unfettered, all the time, everywhere, always to absolutely anybody. We're mindful and we're careful about who might be a reciprocal, willing, meaningful partner in this exchange. So there's some really fascinating work by Kylie Hamlin, who I've collaborated with in the past, but also many other people, showing that even from a young age, young children pay attention to who is a pro-social actor, who is an antisocial actor.
And very, very young. I mean, this is incredible. Like 6 month old, if they see the puppet helping another puppet climb a hill, they're like, yay.
Exactly. So they're tracking these the kind and the antisocial behavior of other actors very early in life. And I think that shows you how deeply ingrained this sensitivity is. And she pointed out really early on that this is kind of the flip side. There's the feeling good about giving, and the fact that that occurs is lovely and beautiful. And in a vacuum, like I said, this could just lead people to keep giving and giving and giving, but that leaves us open to the possibility of exploitation. And so we've also evolved to be really careful to think about who is it that is a trusting, worthy person we want to give to. And so we're very sensitive to these cues of exploitation or some insincerity when it comes to giving.
But it is interesting that insincerity is there. I mean, it's one thing to. I mean, in the classic example, like the puppet helps the other puppet up the hill. Yay! The puppet pushes the puppet down the hill against its obvious wishes. Very bad. But that's very clearly like helping or hindering.
Right.
Helping with a selfish motive, the fact that that almost becomes like hindering or like it goes into the kind of judgment category. That's kind of what I find fascinating. And that can be, I think, also an unhelpful reaction because I mean I have these moments where I kind of decide not to give because I feel like people might look at me like as if I were trying to look like a good person. It can even lead people not to give in a bit of a paradoxical way because if they cannot be sure that people think they're giving for good reasons, it's almost better not to give than to look like you're giving for bad reasons, which I don't find is a very helpful dynamic. I'm wondering where does it come from?
Well, one of my a couple favorite experiments I'll tell you on the sensitivity we have to this thing. One was a a paper written by Newman and Kane that I think demonstrated this so nicely. It presented kind of a scenario in which participants were asked to read about someone who, in one condition, they were told volunteered at the food bank because like for no external motivations. In another condition, they volunteered at the food bank to gain the affection of someone who they were interested in. And in a third condition, the person just did like a personal activity that they liked. And, not surprisingly, when people were doing the pro-social task for sincere motives, they were rated as, kind and very likable. Um, but the question then is, how do people rate a pro-social actor with selfish motives relative to someone who just did something for themselves? And people rated a pro-social actor with selfish motives below someone who just, I don't know, went bowling. Um, and the reason is because we're on very high alert regarding people who might do kind things with these ulterior expectations. And I think it raises this question of untrustworthiness. Is this someone who we can rely upon? Is this someone who signals some kind of moral character? But as you alluded to earlier, I think it's absolutely fascinating that there is some research suggesting that one benefit we allow pro-social actors to enjoy is positive emotions. So when we hear someone gives to charity and they feel good about it, you know, extrapolating from the previous results we just talked about, you might assume that's problematic. And then we don't like them as much. We don't trust them as much. But in fact, the data suggests the opposite, such that when we see somebody give and feel good about it, we interpret that positive emotion as a stronger signal that people were really invested in helping other people. It seems that they gave because they care and they feel good because they were able to help another person. And so positive emotion seems to be the one so far that I'm aware of positive consequence that we allow givers to enjoy.
But hold on a second. It's one thing to allow it as a consequence. It's another thing to allow it as a motive.
Yes.
I don't think people see it material outcomes as a bad thing if they're not the motive. Like let's say in an accident, someone goes and rescues a child, and then everyone's so happy that they now donate for them so that they can rebuild their house because the media picks up that they're a poor person. Okay, people love those kinds of stories where like a hero is being helped. So it's not, I don't think people see it as a negative thing that there is something positive happening as an outcome, as long as that's not the motive. So do the studies you mentioned, do they get to the question of is feeling good about giving an acceptable motive, or is it just a great outcome?
I'm pretty sure all the studies to my memory are on the outcomes. I would have to go back and revisit. I don't think any studies were looking at the motives.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that's a study for a future day.
Mhm.
Um, but I personally have struggled years with um, philosophical and evolutionary debates around selfishness. I mean,
Uh-huh.
the selfish gene. Dawkins famously first said that, don't expect help from our biology because we're, quote, born selfish. And then he later said that please mentally delete that rogue sentence and other like it. I've actually written about this instance and some of the broader lessons around it. And I don't think that we need to have now a long philosophical discussion on the meaning of egoism and stuff. But I do wish that people who debate that would pay attention to literature such as this that you produce, where people are really trying to get at from very, very different angles. And I think even if we couldn't agree on what, is it fundamentally selfish if you feel good after doing it, which I don't even think is that interesting of a question. I think it would be just wonderful for people to realize how varied the different reasons, the different benefits can be, and that there isn't like a one size fits all answer
Mhm.
for why people give. So I appreciate your work for many reasons, but that's one of them. It shows the richness of the giving condition, for the lack of a better word.
Oh, thank you.
Before we finish, always my final question to guests is: how has your research shaped your outlook on humanity?
For the better. I think my personal choices lean way more pro-social than I think perhaps they would have years ago. So whenever I like to think that my default, if I were gifted 70 euros, would be to think about how I can spend it on others. It's become more of a knee jerk reaction to me, or at least just more salient, more top of mind. But I also think this research emerging from my lab and elsewhere and in the World Happiness Report demonstrating the benevolence of others, the prevalence of benevolence just out there, has made me much more optimistic and positive about the world around us than I think I perhaps may have been the more cynical university student before I started.
Lara Aknin, thank you so much for really, really inspiring research and for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. If you enjoyed it, you might want to check out a couple of episodes, episodes 16, 20, and 22. One of them is a conversation about poverty and generosity, one about empathy, compassion in young children. And there is also my only solo episode where I read my essay published in the Skeptic magazine on why evolution does not prove that we are selfish. I hope that you enjoy those. And again, if you feel generous, click the subscribe button, click those 5 stars, and head to patreon.com/onhumans. Anyway, I hope that you're having a wonderful day, and I see you next time. Until then, take care.